never changes. Hey everyone, and welcome to my review for Season 1 of Fallout on Amazon, set in 2296, a continuation of the Fallout timeline 9 years after the events of Fallout 4. Next week I'll be releasing a recap for the season where I'll go over each episode in more detail. So for this video I'll be giving my overall thoughts with a final score at the end, plus my top 10 moments, and I'll be exploring some of the most significant additions and changes to the lore. So first of all, I'll just start by saying I really liked it. I've seen some glowing reactions and reviews online, so I'm not sure I loved it as much as others did, but overall I did really enjoy a lot of it, though there were a few negatives for me as well. Starting with the positives, there are a lot of them. Right away, as soon as I heard the old style music, I was hooked. The entire opening scene was amazing for me, with Walton Goggins doing an incredible job all throughout the season playing Cooper Howard in The Ghoul. In those first few minutes, I had the biggest smile on my face trying to catch all the references to the games. From the look of the radio and TV to Mr. Handy, Nuka-Cola, Sugar Bombs, and Grognak the Barbarian, there were so many details and background objects taken directly from the games. And that's where the show really excelled. Outside of the story and characters, the music, settings, apocalyptic tone, backgrounds, posters, wardrobe, weapons, armor, Pip-Boys, and just about everything else was perfectly done, and really welcomed me into the world, allowing me to accept that what I was seeing really was the next chapter in an already established universe. It made me feel like they would respect the lore from the games, which for the most part they did. Although I'll talk about my top 10 scenes later, some of the other moments I loved included the immediate realization that something was wrong with the residents of Vault 32. I watched the show with someone who didn't play the games, so it was really fun when I immediately noticed the differences and guessed they were raiders that broke into the vault, while the person I watched with didn't come to that realization until the show started to reveal it. I was also a big fan of the over-the-top violence and occasional overacting that really matched the eccentric characters from the game. The acting, for the most part, was excellent, really capturing the extreme desperation of people in the wasteland, in stark contrast to vault dwellers and people from the past, showcasing how many think nothing of risking their lives and can die easily without consideration or care. Some other things I love to see included Norm playing Atomic Command on his Pip-Boy, the use of the junk jet weapon, their dog meat companion, the appearance of NCR Ranger gear, locations like Red Rocket and Super Duper Mart, the lawsuit over Giddy Up Buttercup mentioned in the newspaper, the computer hacking scene, and the Fallout 4 theme music that played over certain scenes in the second half of the show, like when Lucy saw the NCR flag. All great stuff. I already mentioned how much I loved Walton Goggins, but pretty much every scene he touched was pure gold. I think I enjoyed the flashbacks more than anything, seeing his acting days and the relationship with his wife, the sponsorship of Vault-Tec, and the way he eventually turned against them. Some of the scenes that really stood out were his outrage over the exclusion of dogs in the vaults, his talk with Bartholomew Codsworth about siding with capitalism, and the conversation with Charlie Whiteknife about the evils of Vault-Tec. But even in 2296 as the Ghoul, his character was great. To me, the three main storylines following Lucy, Maximus, and the Ghoul each represented different aspects of the player character in the games. Lucy was the origin story of emerging from a vault to accomplish a mission while in the process transforming into a hardened survivor. Maximus was the Brotherhood's side missions present in every game, where you learn about their philosophy and can experiment with power armor. And the Ghoul was the player in combat, where one highly skilled man can take out a town full of gunslingers or a room full of soldiers in power armor, even shooting in the style of someone using bats. The Vault-Tec assisted targeting system from the games that slows down time so you can shoot multiple characters more precisely. So much of the show felt like the games, and that feeling was amplified for me when Lucy and Maximus found the Hawthorne Medical Lab. To me, both Lucy and Maximus displayed the emotions felt in the game when you come across a building to explore. Like Lucy, I'm eager to enter, find treasure, and learn the location's story. But like Maximus, I know there's likely something awful inside and kind of want to skip it entirely. This was a really good scene that felt just like the games. Then there was all the Vault-Tec stuff from the flashbacks, which was delightfully horrifying. Bud Askins especially felt like the perfect representative for Vault-Tec. So happy and eager to prove himself, but with no sense of morality or consideration for the harm he inflicts. Hearing him talk about using time as a tool against their enemies and how the future comes down to management was perfectly delivered and really felt like his sincere beliefs, no matter how preposterous it really was. The last big positive I want to mention is the hint of civil war brewing in the Brotherhood of Steel, or at least a schism of some kind like we saw in Fallout 3 between the Lions Brotherhood and Outcasts. They didn't say much, but Elder Cleric Quintus mentioned using the cold fusion tech to start a new brotherhood, with him as the leader and Maximus as an enforcer. Although we didn't get much info about the leadership of the Brotherhood at this time, personally I feel that Arthur Maxon is still alive and is the High Elder of all Brotherhood chapters across the former United States, and that's why the Pridwin was sent to California. However, since leadership was traditionally held by a brother from the West Coast, it's possible Quintus no longer wants to take orders from the other side of the continent, and is ready to claim leadership of the West Coast, which to me means we might see a Brotherhood civil war in the future, when Arthur Maxon brings his forces to fight the Rebel Brotherhood in California. Moving on now to the negatives, there weren't many, but there definitely were some things that lessened my enjoyment of certain episodes, and the biggest negative for me was the Maximus character and his storyline. Both the Ghoul and Lucy felt like very compelling characters even when I didn't agree with their decisions, but Maximus for me was immensely uninteresting and boring. Learning that he survived Shady Sands and joined the Brotherhood for revenge I thought was great background material, but the character didn't live up to his potential. To me, he seemed lazy, weak-willed, and highly incompetent from the very beginning, with absolutely no loyalty to his friend or the Brotherhood, willing to betray them, lie, break the rules, and abandon them at a moment's notice. Sometimes imperfect and unlikable characters can still be compelling, but in his case, I just found him unimpressive and boring to watch. Both the Ghoul and Lucy excelled in their own ways, but Maximus just seemed to stumble from one mistake to another and end up in a better position than when he started. The Brotherhood as a whole I thought was presented quite well, but again my interest lessened when they had to deal directly with Maximus, as I couldn't understand why Elder Cleric Quintus kept promoting him despite his obvious disloyalty and lies. It seems to me like there is some value in using the rise of such an imperfect character to demonstrate the absurdity of this world, but in this case, I felt like it made the Brotherhood look very amateur and undisciplined. To me, the only way this makes sense is if the Elder specifically sees his traitorous behavior as beneficial, since it makes Maximus more likely to support his future rebellion. But still, all this combined made me lose interest in many of the Brotherhood scenes. Beyond that, in general, I found the show to balance humor and seriousness well, but I think it was handled better in the first few episodes, as later on it felt like they were being a bit too silly, especially with some of the stuff in Vault 4 whose people apparently don't guard their fusion core even after catching Maximus near it before. Some of the other negatives for me were that the Overseer Hank McLean knew about Moldaver but didn't recognize her very well-known name. I also found it odd the deceased residents of Vault 32 were not discovered for 2 years, despite the 3 vaults regularly training their people. Although most of the Ghoul's fight scenes were great, how was it he knew about a weakness in power armor but didn't use that to defeat Maximus during the fight in Philly? And the last negative for me, which is kind of a big one, is that I felt absolutely no emotional connection to Lucy, Maximus, or their relationship. Even though I did like the Lucy character a lot, I felt no real connection with her at the end when she was devastated by all she learned. I found the information being conveyed interesting, but didn't feel the emotional impact. I did, however, feel that connection to Cooper Howard and the Ghoul. So those were my general thoughts for this season, which means it's time for my top 10 moments, starting with number 10, which for me was Maximus enjoying the luxuries of his Vault 4 home. Even though I wasn't the biggest fan of his character, I did really like watching him indulge in all the comforts he never experienced. I also loved seeing all the products from the games like Yum Yum Deviled Eggs, Cram, Sugar Bombs, Fancy Lad Snack Cakes, and Blamco Mac and Cheese. At number 9, I have the creepy wasteland doctor turning the squire into some kind of ghoul or mutant. This character kept popping up throughout the season, and every time I found him hilarious, and exactly like the type of medicine man I would expect to find in this post-apocalyptic world. At number 8, I chose Lucy escaping Vault 33 and disappearing into the light beyond the door. To me, this was a great reference to the screen going completely white when you leave your vault for the first time in the games, though this time we see it from the perspective of those inside the vault. At number 7, I went with the intro to episode 1, specifically when the bombs started to drop, as I felt these first few minutes of the show were handled absolutely perfectly, with the proper amount of world building, character introductions, and a powerfully momentous event that somehow shocked me even though I obviously knew it was coming. Watching everyone panic and scramble for safety was very engaging and was made all the more terrifying by focusing on Cooper Howard desperately fleeing with his daughter. At number 6, I chose Norm and Chet visiting Vault 32 and discovering how they destroyed themselves. I'll talk more about this during the lore part of the review, but seeing the dead bodies and chaotic state of the vault really gave me the feeling of exploring a vault in the games. And the image of the Overseer's corpse smiling with his thumb up really stood out as an amazing visual that left me eager to learn the truth about these vaults. For the number 5 spot, I chose Cooper Howard's Vault 4 commercial, which was so well done, perfectly portraying him as a 1950s style movie star in the 21st century. I think it was smart of Amazon to use this commercial in their marketing material for the show, as I loved seeing it in the trailer and was looking forward to seeing the whole thing in the show. At number 4, we stay with Cooper Howard's Vault Tech ads, as we learn the origins of the Vault Boy thumbs up logo plastered throughout the games. Watching the actor pose in those colors and raise his thumb felt like such a cool and interesting reveal, adding to the heartbreak of his character in the future as he has to see that Vault-Tec imagery everywhere he wandered. For the third best moment of the season, I went with Norm discovering the truth behind Vault 31 and the Buds Buds program. This was really shocking for me, as learning that Vault-Tec workers were still alive and participating in the Vault program was an absolutely incredible revelation that had me craving more information. All throughout the Fallout games, I was always haunted by questions about what happened to Vault-Tec and whether they were still involved with any of the vaults after the bombs dropped. So learning that all the Vault 31 residents were former junior executives still working to accomplish their original mission was absolutely thrilling. At the number 2 spot, I chose the very last scene of Season 1, when Hank in his power armor arrived outside the city of New Vegas with all the questions and ideas that raises, leaving me dying for Season 2 so I can find out what happened to Mr. House, which ending from Fallout New Vegas is canon, and ultimately learn why Hank is there, as well as the city's connection to Vault-Tec. And finally, what for me was the best and most interesting moment of the entire season, and that's Vault-Tec's meeting with leaders from some of the biggest corporations in America, revealing how they cooperated to use vaults as experiments so they might find the best way to run a new civilization, and how Vault-Tec was ready to drop the bombs themselves in order to start their experiments and claim a monopoly over the future of humanity. Although much of this scene was excellent, including the involvement of Mr. House, one of my favorite characters from all the games. For me, the most intriguing part was when Cooper Howard's wife looked up at the gallery of onlookers, staring at one shadowy figure in particular, which, to me, felt like an Enclave representative, overseeing the project from behind the scenes, as we know from the games how the Enclave was deeply involved with Vault-Tec, and yet their connection was entirely absent from the show, suggesting to me that the shadowy figure watching on must be an Enclave official. So now I'm going to move on to what for me were the most significant parts of the season, and those were the lore additions and changes made to the established canon. I won't be going over everything, but we'll be exploring some of what I consider to be the most interesting and important revelations from the show. Starting off with some smaller but fascinating additions and possible changes, there was Maximus describing the Fiend's Raider gang as cannibals, when in the games they were known for being extreme chem addicts. They did have a character called Cook, known for preparing their meals, but as far as I know, he was never described or implied to be a cannibal. It is, however, possible that in the 15 years since the events of Fallout New Vegas, the Fiends have spread further west and grown more desperate, leading them to start practicing cannibalism. There was also the introduction of a drug that keeps ghouls from turning feral, which is apparently readily available on the West Coast for those who can pay. Although this is new information, we do know that there are drugs in this world that can turn people into ghouls, which is what happened to Hancock in Fallout 4. So it's not that crazy that another drug might hinder the ghoulification process to some degree. However, since we haven't heard about it before, I'm not sure it's all that widespread or well known outside New California. Another fascinating thing we saw was the Prydwen airship on the West Coast, which means the ending of Fallout 4 has been more or less revealed. Since it appears as though the Prydwen was not destroyed, the canonical ending of Fallout 4 has to be the Brotherhood of Steel ending or the Minutemen ending. But given the focus on the Brotherhood in this show, to me, the Brotherhood reigning over the Commonwealth seems the most likely conclusion to the War of 2287. Speaking of which, I also personally believe the Prydwen being on the West Coast means Arthur Maxon united all of the country's Brotherhood chapters under his leadership and rules as High Elder from the East Coast. Since the High Elder has traditionally been from the West, this seems like good background motivation for Elder Cleric Quintus to start his rebellion and seek leadership of his own faction, similar to what we saw in Appalachia and the Capital Wasteland, where the Brotherhood chapters led by Layla Romani and Owen Lyons broke off from the leadership to pursue their own personal goals. The next addition to the Fallout lore that really stood out to me comes from one of my favorite parts of the games, which is exploring the different vaults of the Wasteland. so I was very happy to learn the stories of Vault 4, 31, 32, and 33. Starting with the most disturbing experiment of them all, Vault 4 was featured in a commercial starring Cooper Howard and was designed to be run by scientists with no oversight or regulations. Among their many horrifying experiments, the scientists tried to hybridize humans with radiation-resistant species, forcing women to birth schools of monstrous baby gulpers, horrifying fish-like creatures which viciously consumed their mothers. In time, the residents of Vault 4 rebelled and released the gulpers against their leaders, which killed the scientists before escaping into the wasteland. Vault 4 was then turned into a peaceful settlement which accepted refugees and elected their leader. As for the interconnected Vaults 31, 32, and 33, they were run directly by Vault-Tec, with Vault 31 hosting the cryogenically frozen junior executives of the Buds Buds program, with one of their highly trained managers ready to be unfrozen and introduced to either Vault 32 or 33, where they would lead a new society and selectively breed new generations of super managers that would one day return to the surface and restart civilization. Although this experiment ran well for 2 centuries, in 2294, the residents of Vault 32 learned the truth, discovering they were products of a tyrannical corporation seeking to control every aspect of their existence. Devolving into chaos, some of the residents ended their own lives, while others fought and killed each other, leaving the overseer's deceased corpse posing at his desk. Some even tried to break into Vault 31 but failed, and in the end they all lost their lives. Adding yet another dimension to the Vault-Tec intrigue, there was maybe the most significant moment of the entire series, when Vault-Tec hosted a meeting with Big MT, Repcon, Westech, and Robco to discuss a partnership where each would take ownership of several vaults to run their own private experiments, seeking the best way to run a society. Among the suggestions made, they mentioned purposely overcrowding a vault so the residents had to compete to survive, referencing the experiment conducted in Vault 27. Another spoke of a super soldier program, referring to Vault 87, which used FEV to create super mutants. Drugs in the air supply happened at Vault 106, while the separation of parents and children happened at Vault 29 and 75. Vault-Tec then mentioned dropping the nuclear bombs themselves, suggesting that we finally have an answer to who dropped the bombs first, as Vault-Tec appeared to be behind it. But all we saw was a discussion about possibly dropping the bombs. We know they had access to nukes, and Hank eventually uses one against Shady Sands, so it's definitely possible, but I still think there's enough evidence this might not be the case. Firstly, from the games, we know many of the vaults weren't ready when the bombs dropped. And in the show, the executive Barb Howard didn't have her daughter with her, meaning she must not have been aware it was happening that day. So for me personally, I still think there's a chance it was the Chinese who were on the brink of total defeat, which was the prevailing theory beforehand. But it's exciting to think about and makes me eager for Season 2 and more answers. I'm also waiting to learn more about the Enclave, as I really think the shadowy figure watching the meeting was an Enclave representative. Okay, now let's get to the big one, the revelation about the fall of the NCR and Shady Sands. First, it seems like the location of Shady Sands has been moved. In the games, it was north of the LA Boneyard, near Vaults 13 and 15. But in the show, they seem to have moved it south to Los Angeles. They also called Shady Sands the first capital of the NCR, but as far as we know, it was the only capital they had and still seemed to be the capital in 2282, at the end of Fallout New Vegas. Of course, they likely had other capitals after the fall of Shady Sands, but why would that be written on a billboard created when the city was still standing? So that part confused me a bit. But what seems to have most upset people was the timeline of events presented in the classroom scene. We'll talk about the fall of Shady Sands in a bit, but let's start at the beginning, because the first thing I noticed was that they dated the founding of Shady Sands to 2142. Although this date does in fact correspond with a date given in the semi-canon Fallout Bible, it is not the date that makes the most sense according to the timeline. According to Fallout 1, Shady Sands was supposedly founded by an ancestor of Aradesh, but in 2142, Aradesh was already born. The Fallout Bible 6 then corrected this date through the Viper design document, which states Vault 15 opened around 2097, after which the residents spread to form several raider gangs and the settlement Shady Sands. Since the show is stated 2142 is the correct date, for me what makes sense is that Vault 15 opened in 2097 when an ancestor of Aradesh left and founded a settlement the next year in 2098, since the Fallout Bible states it was 1 year after the opening. This settlement perhaps had a different name or no name at all until 2142, when it officially became known as Shady Sands. The next date in the timeline was 2189 for the creation of the NCR, which again stands out because the NCR was actually formed in 2186 as a trial government out of Shady Sands, but in 2189 grew to include the first 5 states of the nation. The timeline then says Shady Sands became the capital in 2198, which is 2 years after Tandy, the daughter of Aradesh, became president of the NCR, which I suppose is possible, though it seems more likely it was always considered the capital from the beginning. Next is 2241, when the NCR became the largest economic and political power in California, which is the same year the Chosen One from Fallout 2 left his home of Arroyo to start his adventures in the Wasteland. Then we get to the final given date, 2277, for the fall of Shady Sands, with an arrow pointing to an explosion. For a while it seemed like many were debating exactly what this meant, as 2277 made no sense for the bomb to drop on Shady Sands, but thankfully Todd Howard has clarified that the arrow indicated the bombs fell after 2277, which means it likely fell in 2282, after the Fallout New Vegas storyline, where we know the city still exists. So with that problem solved, all that remains is to explain why 2277 was chosen for the fall of Shady Sands, even though it was still the capital of a strong nation for several years afterward. But to me, this date actually does make sense, as this was the year the NCR defeated Caesar's Legion in the First Battle of Hoover Dam. Although the NCR won and expanded further east, this also weakened them in many ways, as they overextended their forces, so that a few years later in 2282, they were on the verge of possibly suffering a defeat against the Legion in the Second Battle of Hoover Dam. Although they probably didn't realize it in 2277, I think in retrospect it makes sense as a date for the beginning of the NCR's decline. The character of Moldaver was also an interesting addition, as somehow she survived 2 centuries, possibly frozen like the others, to become a revered cult figure on a mission to bring cold fusion and limitless energy to the wasteland, while leading what appears to be the remnants of NCR forces from the Griffith Observatory. Though, I think she may have been leading just one of the many factions that might have risen after the fall of the NCR government, which is another subject I hope gets explored in Season 2. So, like I said at the beginning, I did really like this show. It wasn't perfect by any means, but they did get so many things right, I find it hard to fault them for the few negatives I didn't enjoy. So with all that being said, I'm gonna give Season 1 of Fallout on Amazon a solid 8.5 out of 10, and highly recommend this show to anyone seeking a fun post-apocalyptic world with plenty of lore and backstory to dive into. As for those who love the games, it seems like an absolute necessity to watch the show, if for no other reason than to happily spot the many references littered throughout every episode. So that's it for my review of Fallout Season 1, but I'm curious to know what you all thought. How did you feel about the show? Were you as impressed as I was with all the references and details from the games? And what do you guys think of the lore additions? Please let me know in the comments below, and be sure to look out for my Season 1 recap video, which should be out next week. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next season. A special thanks to all those who contribute to CivilizationEx, like Sir Dayron of House Ashford, Fred Heartless, Knight of Iron and Ice, Ishmael Ahmed of Shamidiana, and Barachado. If you'd like to help the channel, be sure to give a like, leave a comment, subscribe, and click on the links below, or else go to patreon.com/CivilizationEx, where you can gain early access to videos, vote on future content, and watch the Patreon-only series, Heroes of Lore and Legend.